When Adolf Eichmann stood trial in Jerusalem in 1961, many people expected to see a monster. They expected to see someone who was visibly evil, someone who looked insane, crazy. Instead, they just saw an ordinary looking bureaucrat sitting calmly inside a bulletproof glass booth, repeatedly insisting that he was not personally responsible for the deaths of millions. He argued that he had simply been following orders. This defense raises a question that continues to haunt history, psychology, and politics today. How far can obedience excuse human actions? This question becomes the foundation of one of the most famous psychological studies ever conducted, the Milgram obedience experiments. In the early 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a series of experiments at Yale University to investigate how far ordinary people would go in obeying an authority figure, even when doing so directly conflicted with their own moral conscience. Milgram's motivation was deeply historical. Following the Nuremberg trials after World War II, many Nazi officials defended themselves by claiming that they had just been following orders. Milgram wanted to find out and understand whether obedience to authority was an abnormal trait of a few individuals or universal human tendency. In this experiment, participants were instructed to administer increasingly severe electric shocks to another participant, referred to as the loner. Unknown to the participants, the shocks were fake and the loner was an actor. Nevertheless, participants believed that the pain was real. The findings were shocking. Milgram found that approximately 65% of participants continued administering shocks all the way to the maximum voltage level, despite hearing apparent cries of pain and pleas to stop. These findings suggest that ordinary people could commit acts that violated their own morals, their own ethical values, when instructed to do so by an authority figure. One explanation for this behavior was what Milgram termed the agentic state. In this psychological state, individuals shifted responsibility for their actions onto the authority figure. Participants no longer viewed themselves as morally responsible agents. Instead, they saw themselves as instruments carrying out another person's wishes. The authority figure, rather than the individual, was perceived as bearing responsibility for the consequences. However, what interested me most about Milgram's findings was not the fact that 65% of participants obeyed. It was the fact that obedience dramatically decreased under very certain conditions. Firstly, when the experimenter delivered these instructions over the telephone rather than being physically present, obedience dropped from 65% to 21%. When participants observed peers refusing to continue with the experiment, rebellion, obedience fell to 10%. This raises an important question. Perhaps people do not obey unjust systems because they genuinely support them. Perhaps they obey because they believe that they are alone in resisting them. That is a very important phrase. Let me repeat. Perhaps people do not obey unjust systems because they genuinely support them. Perhaps they obey because they believe that they are alone in resisting them. It is also important to remember that in the original experiment, 35% of participants refused to continue. These individuals appear to operate from an autonomous state, where they accepted personal responsibility for their actions rather than transferring it to the authority figure. They recognized that continuing the experiment would violate their own moral conscience and chose to stop on their own. This actually reflects their ethical values and their morals. This distinction between the agentic and autonomous state becomes particularly interesting when examined through historical examples. During the Nuremberg trials, Adolf Eichmann, one of the key officials involved in implementing the Holocaust, repeatedly defended himself by arguing that he was simply a cog in a larger machine. He claimed that he had no personal malice against the victims. Now, he said that he was merely carrying out orders that were issued by his superiors on the state. In many ways, Eichmann's defense reflected the psychological process that Milgram would later describe as the agentic state. the surrender of personal moral responsibility to authority. The surrender of personal moral responsibility to authority. Yet Eichmann was not the only senior Nazi official put on trial. Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect and minister of armaments, responded very differently. During the Nuremberg trial, Speer was one of the few high-ranking defendants who rejected the just following orders defense. Instead, he publicly accepted responsibility for his role within the Nazi regime. He later reflected on how modern bureaucratic systems make it easy for individuals to compartmentalize their actions so that no single person feels morally accountable for the final outcome. By rejecting the psychological shield, Speer appeared to move from an agentic state to an autonomous one, accepting his own moral responsibility rather than attributing it entirely to authority. Now, this contrast between Eichmann and Speer leaves us with several unresolved questions. Was Eichmann truly operating in an agentic state, or was he more ideologically committed than he later admitted? Why did Speer accept responsibility when so many others refused to? And perhaps this is the most difficult question of all. Is the "I was just following orders" defense ever going to even be a morally valid excuse? Now, my current working hypothesis is this: people obey unjust systems not necessarily because they support them, but because they believe that they are alone in resisting them. Whether this hypothesis is correct is something I still have to investigate.